Thank you. And on behalf of the Circular Economy Leadership Coalition and the Globe series, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today as your moderator for a brave conversation, leveraging COVID to transition to circular plastics. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you from Treaty 6 territory and the traditional meeting ground and home for many Indigenous peoples, including Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, and more peoples. My name is Christina Seidel. I'm the Executive Director of the Recycling Council of Alberta, as well as a proud member of the National Zero Waste Council. We are so thrilled today to see that we have over 400 people registered for this session. So we're really looking forward to some really interesting interaction. There is no doubt that plastics has captured the world's attention and has really been a priority, both globally and domestically, for at least 2 years, but especially recently. In the last 8 months, we've seen our everyday lives and world turned upside down in ways we really couldn't have foreseen. So today is our opportunity to reflect on what this means for our collective efforts to stem the tide on plastic pollution and urgently advance new solutions and approaches to realizing a smart, sustainable, and circular plastics economy of the future, where plastics are kept in the economy and out of the environment. Within that context and with the time we have, we want to have a brave conversation. In this new reality, what questions do we need to be asking? What new opportunities and what risks do we have to face? What will be emerging? And finally, looking beyond our own individual actions, what leadership, innovation, and collaboration and disruption do we need to make immediate and real progress on plastics? We are so thrilled today and privileged to be joined by 5 prominent leaders who together bring a diversity of perspectives and depth of knowledge to bear on this important issue. As we will hear shortly, a new groundbreaking study, Breaking the Plastic Wave, suggests that we can solve the plastic pollution crisis in one single generation. So we're going to kick this off by doing a quick audience poll. So over to you in the audience now for your thoughts on this question. On a scale of 1 to 4, with 1 being not a chance and 4 being for sure we can do this, how do you rate your response to the question whether we can solve the plastics pollution crisis in one generation? And to help us now and to introduce our panelists, we're going to actually hear from them on this question as well. So joining us from Europe is Martin Stuktai. Martin is the founder and managing partner of System IQ and one of the authors behind the groundbreaking study that we're going to be hearing about today, Breaking the Plastic Wave. Welcome, Martin. So on that scale of 1 to 4, how do you feel about the likelihood of us being able to solve the crisis in one generation?
Hey, Christina. Thanks a lot for the warm introduction. Thanks for allowing me to brave with you today. It's a 4. Come on, it's a 4. If we don't
Excellent.
get that challenge right, how should we look in front of other even larger challenges? Let it please be a 4.
Fantastic, Martin. Thank you. Now I'm going to move on to Erin Simon. Erin is the head of plastic waste and business with the World Wildlife Fund. So Erin, if you can give us your opinion on the scale of 1 to 4.
I have to agree with Martin. We really have no choice. It has to be a 4.
Okay, I'm really liking where this is headed. Okay, and Erin joined us from the US, and now joining us from Ontario is Kevin Groh. Kevin is Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs and Communication at Loblaw Companies Limited. So Kevin, what's your rating on the 1 to 4 of whether or not we can solve this crisis in one generation?
I think I have to continue with the trend. So it's ambitious, but the pieces and the parts of the roadmap are there for us to look at and there for us to act. So we should.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. Now, joining us from my home province of Alberta and providing a government perspective is David James. David is Associate Deputy Minister of Natural Gas and Electricity at Department of Energy with the Government of Alberta. So David, what's your opinion on the scale of 1 to 4 and the likelihood of solving this in one generation?
Thanks, Christina. I think we absolutely need to strive for a 4. I have to be a little bit a little bit maybe guarded. I think it's likely that we can get there, and not to disagree with my colleagues. I think we have to push for it. I think there's a lot of things that need to align in order to do that, and we want to take a role in that. But so I think it's likely. It's just going to take a lot of people to show the leadership you spoke about.
Excellent. Thank you very much, David. And joining us from British Columbia and providing an investment perspective is Jamie Bonham. Jamie is Director Corporate Engagement with NEI Investments. So Jamie, tell us how you feel about this poll.
Thanks, Christina. And thank you, David, for being the first one to not say 4. To be honest, I entered 3. I think that's still optimistic, and I'm an optimistic person by nature. So I do think it's very likely. I just always hedge my bet. What can I say?
Okay, thank you so much, Jamie. And thank you everybody for joining us. It's going to be a very interesting conversation. So now I see we have the poll results from the audience up. So you can see we've got for having to actually solve it in one generation, looks like it's a possibility. So again, it's nice that our panelists are actually really positive, and so we're hopefully, not hopefully, we know we're going to hear a lot of inspiration today. So thank you very much for responding to the poll and participating in this webinar. Just so you know, we're going to be using a chat function for questions today. I know there's going to be lots of questions, and I'll be monitoring the questions, so please enter them into the chat. I think you all know how to use chat now. This is not going to be your first webinar. So we'll get to as many questions as we can. If you have any problems with like technical issues, please use the chat for that as well. And when you put in your questions, please make sure that you're addressing them to all panelists and other attendees so that we can all see them and everybody can see the questions you're asking. Okay, let's go on to the speakers now. This is really what we've been excited about. So Martin, over to you to give us a snapshot of some of the key findings from this fabulous report, Breaking the Plastics Wave. So over to you.
Christina, thanks again. It's very nice to be with all of you today. We have been collectively discussing this question of plastic for a while. And the point I think I'll be making is that now, despite the crisis, in the crisis, because of the crisis, it's the moment to make all the structural shifts that I actually needed to solve it. I've been working just as a matter of background for the last 15, 20 years, working on, writing about the circular economy. I've also done a lot of work during that time for sustainable ocean management, and plastic conveniently sits between those two realms. It's not just an evident truth that there's too much plastic going into ecosystems. A few years back, on an evening before the World Economic Forum, we did a back of the envelope that there might be in 2020 3 kilograms of fish to 1 kilogram of plastic, and that number went viral, and I never got the ghost back in the bottle. Perhaps that's good. So in this report, we were saying that in a year, in 2040, there will be 50 kilograms of plastic being entering the ocean for every meter of shoreline. This is a future that no one of us, whether you are industry, NGO, whatever, can want. That alone, those pictures, they move us. But the fact that we talk so much about plastic probably also has to do with the fact that it reminds us in a much deeper way of how far we have departed from the very design principles of nature. Plastic is the horseman of the circular economy. Now, our recent work that you kindly referred to, Christina, was born probably more out of frustration than of curiosity. Too many conferences, too many meetings where very different propositions remain unreconciled, uncontested. Zero plastic, let's move away from it altogether. Burn and bury, there is enough space for it to be deposited safely and efficiently. Recycle, we can recycle our way out of it. Clean it up, look, we always had ecological overshoots during growth phases. There's always time to clean it up later. Biodegradability, look, there will be very quickly a generation of materials that will essentially vanish in front of our eyes. So we thought this is not actually leading us to the answers we need. We joined forces with the Pew Charitable Trust. We convened an exquisite group of 17 renowned experts. We partnered up with Oxford University for the modeling. We built a global system level interconnected model, and then it was reviewed and published in Science. What we found is the business as usual is gruesome. Out of the 350 million tons produced every year, 15 million tons actually come in municipal waste system. It's from there that they leak into the environment. That number is about to double until 2040. The number that is actually leaking into ecosystems is going to triple, and the amount that will sit in the ocean realm is going to quadruple. The second thing that we found out, that all the current commitments that we see from plastic bans, government commitments, but also self-commitments from companies are not bending the curve. So they all add up to a reduction of the business as usual of something like less than 7%. So we still live in a world where production volumes are going to be doubled despite those commitments. That's the second.
Third,
there's no silver bullet. We tried to introduce a couple of tests, and I'm sparing you the details: an affordability test, a technology test, a performance test, a consumer acceptance test, and a feasibility test. And we said, look, within passing these tests, how far can we push a recycling-only solution? How far can we push a reduction solution? How far can we push essentially a linear landfilling pollution? And every time it would, in the best case, just about flatten the curve. The next thing we found, there is an integrated solution. We called it the system change scenario, that actually gets us to solve the problem, at least in a way that reduces the amount that goes into the environment by 80%. And the next thing that we said, this solution is a solution that's to be liked, because until 2040, it will create a solution that's not just good for the environment, it's also good for consumers, it's also good for government, it's also good for innovative industries. Let me quickly take you through the chart which you have in front of you now. And it's probably the one chart that allows us to get the full story. Let's first talk about the consumer perspective. They get what they want. In Systemic and my company, we talk a lot about utility. So we accept that there will be an increase in the utility, in the service, and the benefit that today is delivered by single-use plastic. So we are not taking anything away from the consumers. They got what they want. However, they get it in ways different from today. A quarter of what they will need in 2040, they get in ways dematerialized. That's reduce, eliminate, reuse, new delivery models, refill stations, etc. Another 13–14% of the 2040 demand for the utility of what single-use plastic does today, they will get in ways non-plastic substitute, so paper, coated paper, compostables. Whilst we completely understand that some of them come with an additional carbon load, many of them don't, and so they are very viable solutions. And then another quarter of what they will need in 2040 will come in ways plastic, but in ways non-virgin plastic. And it's only the remaining part, the yellow and the green part, that will be delivered in the ways today, which is based on virgin plastic. So in other words, the consumer get what they want. Now for industry as well, you can consider every one of those wedges, the blue wedge, the green wedge, essentially interesting growth industry. There is economic activity happening in every one of them. So you want to be in a growth industry. So the reduce industry is a fast growing one. The substitute industry is a fast growing one. The circular plastic industry is a fast growing one. So also you can tell a positive story for industry. You can then tell a positive story for governments, who today pick up most of the cost of recovery and waste management. This solution that we show actually comes at 15% cost less to government, which has to do with the fact that despite higher collection rates, there's less volume coming through due to the powerful reduce wedge. And it's better for communities. We think that this solution sort of holds at least 1 million additional jobs. And of course, as I said, it's better for the environment. That's what we started out with, not just for the ocean, minus 80% leakage, but also for the climate. This solution that we are showing is 25% better than solution that business as usual would offer us. In order to get there, there is a lot to be done. We need to bring 4 billion people until 2040 into collection. 500,000 people a day, every day between now and 2040. We need to increase the amount of plastic that's really recyclable from 21% to 54%. We need to build 2 completely new sectors of the economy, the mechanical recycling sector and the P2P chemical recycling sector. We need to basically build a sector which is called the reduce and substitute sector. All of that is possible. It's within the realm of available technology today. However, we will not gravitate there automatically. It's a structural set of decisions, and it's a structural shift that would only take us there. And never, that's my point that I want to, that's my proposition to this group, never has the opportunity been better to do it today, despite where we are. And we are right now in the deep pandemic, and I want to sympathize with everyone in Canada and around the world around those consequences. It has done 2 things to the plastic world. On the one hand, demand is up. So we have seen something like a 25% increase in waste use per capita in the US, for example, Germany 21%. And a lot of that is, of course, also additionally driven by PPE and hygienic equipment. And we are faced with a significant breakdown of the recycle and the recovery market. The lockdown has basically frozen 80% of recovery activities in Vietnam, Philippines, and India. More than 45% of the recycling facilities in the UK are reporting disruptions, and due to the oil price that is fairly low, it's just the markets have essentially broken down for recycled material. That's our challenge, but I think this time also comes with a huge opportunity. First, it's the right market conditions for change, and secondly, it's the right political conditions for change. First of all, the market conditions. Now is the time that we can revise some of the subsidies and some of the market failures that we actually see. We all need to remind ourselves that the oil and gas sector is still being subsidized with some 5 trillion around the world at a moment when 90% of the recycling costs for plastic are still sitting with the taxpayer. And I think it's also the right political moment. We have seen many systems in accelerated change in recent months due to the crisis. And we have started to build health system, information system that are very complex, that we otherwise would have taken years. Building this plastic sector that we need actually requires to bring many structural elements into place: EPRs, eco-design, market activation for recycled content, deposit return system, waste management standards, transparency, a carbon tax. Let's never forget, a carbon tax is also good for better and more thoughtful use of plastic. All of these need to be brought in place. In Europe, where I come from and from where I'm greeting you, we currently have something that we call the European Green Deal, which we are using very much as a reset mechanism. And one of the pieces of work that that has come out in recent weeks is that one of the best sectors to turn to have a fast recovery and to have a rebound in employment is in fact building a recycling sector. But to build it, you need to have those structural conditions in place. And that's why the first time government is all over it, and industry is all over it. So yes, I started off, it's a 4 out of 4. This, in the greater scheme of things, is a tough, a wicked, but a solvable problem that we created in a generation and that we should be able to solve in a generation. Christina.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you for reminding us of the imperative that we face, as well as giving us a vision of how we can actually get through this. So now we are going to go to our panelists so we can get some feedback from them. So I'm hoping that the panelists can give us some initial reflections on some of what Martin has had to say, and potentially also add some additional issues that they feel are critical to us really realizing a circular plastics economy. So if we can start with you, Erin, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much. And Martin, thank you for sharing all of that. It's really great to have some more clarity in the roadmap. As you said, we had we started really wide and like exploring solutions around the plastic waste issue, and now we're trying to narrow it into what is going to really get us to that systems change. And at World Wildlife Fund, it always comes back to thinking about these global crises in this really holistic way, right? And with many global crises, like with many of them that are happening right now, the pandemic is just making that more complicated. I know Martin alluded to this, but the studies have shown us that the pandemic has triggered an estimated global use of 129 billion face masks and 65 billion gloves every month. That same study is showing that 2020 will produce 30%, so nearly a third more waste than 2019. And so we don't have extensive data yet, right, to fully answer that question of whether or not we're going to have more waste with absolute certainty, but the result will likely be some net increase, and much of that is going to find its way to places it doesn't belong, like nature. And COVID also came at a time when we were already sort of struggling with how to balance the world's resources, right? And so when we're thinking about circularity, that's really what you're doing. You're really thinking about where stuff is coming from and how you're cascading its value. And the latest Living Planet report, for example, shows that we're overusing the Earth's biocapacity by about 56%. And this is driving a huge reduction in vertebrate biodiversity, so 68%. We're losing intact ecosystems, and of course, we're polluting our oceans. And at the same time, UNEP data is showing us that per person, our global stock of natural capital has declined by nearly 40% since the 90s. And that's the piece of the earth that we each sort of get allocated as a human. But we've doubled what we've produced in that time period. And of course, our populations are growing. So we're overtaxing the planet. As this community, which we've seen in the comments and through Martin's talking points, we all know too well that a lot of that, what we're taking, is going to waste and ultimately ending up in nature. And so here's where we think circular economy comes in, right? Not as an end game, but this mechanism for enabling the systems change that's necessary to solve this global crisis. One thing that's important to highlight here is that while circularity is a powerful tool in helping us to get to more sustainable futures, better use of resources, it in itself is not the end goal, because it is in fact possible for a system to be circular but not sustainable. So we need to make sure that these circular solutions work for both planet and people. And I think that's really important here when we're talking about this sort of diverse set of solutions that we need to be considering, that we're not shifting impacts, right, to another part of the system that we're just not focused on in that moment, whether that's through deforestation or climate or through food waste. It's just this general understanding that just because it's not plastic doesn't make it necessarily better from an environmental or social perspective. And so to do this, right, we need to really think differently. We need to identify those levers that we as institutions, as individuals, can pull to influence that systems change. That starts with the basics, right, of rethinking how we source, use, reuse, dispose of plastics, right? But it also is, more importantly, is about collaborating and working closely with all the stakeholders that we need to encourage these more circular systems. Pushing on collective change from a policy perspective, as Martin also alluded to, is currently seen as one of the most urgent mechanisms needed for systems change, beyond cleaning up our own house, right? If we're going to get the infrastructure for recycling, the infrastructure for reuse, the infrastructure for, reductions, and the policy and legislation needed for that, that's going to come with that collective action and pushing on really solid legislative packages to drive that. And that's going to be really the only way we can decouple economic growth from the dependency on more and more from the planet, that it just won't have to give. And so where my optimism towards number 4 is that we have to do that. We are, we're at this point in time where we have no choice. And I think with the plastic waste problem that we are poised more than we ever have been before, with all the right stakeholders at the table to sort of lean in collectively to do it. So I'm hopeful. Thanks.
Fantastic, Erin. Thank you so much. And it's such a great point that we can't just be circular, we need to be sustainable. So thank you so much for that message. I'm now going to go to David to give us his reflections on what he's heard.
Thanks very much, Christina. I think it's a great question. I appreciate everything that Martin and Erin had to say as well. I think from the Alberta government's perspective, when we think about what's going on right now, we think about the economics and the environmental drivers that are coming out of COVID to advance that strong circular economy. We've recently taken a view around how do we think about the full value chain around those resources and our responsibilities around those value chains. And so as COVID certainly increased the demand for plastics around the globe, there's a desire for higher recycled content. That same demand growth, we think, is going to help to shift the economics that allow industry and governments to implement recycling systems that allow us to bend that plastics economy away from waste. And it's absolutely got to be a whole of government approach, a whole of the sector approach. It's got to be integrated. And I think the points about leadership and innovation and collaboration are absolutely front and center in the work that we're doing. To that effect, we have, under the Canadian Council of Ministers of Environment, supported the Zero Plastics Waste Initiative. We have more recently look towards an opportunity to engage around EPR frameworks within the provinces. You and I have been working on, Christina, with our colleagues in environment and parks as well. And so when we think about the approach we're taking here in Alberta and our part of this global problem, because we think that it is absolutely a global problem, we're trying to take that more comprehensive look at the value chain. And as we do intend to grow the petrochemical sector, we are doing it in a way that is intended to be sustainable. We're working with them on carbon capture and storage. We're working with them on driving emissions down. We have a carbon framework within the province. We have emissions requirements for those companies themselves. And what we're trying to do is build the industrial capacity and economies of scale that are required to capture and retain the value of plastics. We think countries like Canada and Alberta have a real role to play in making sure that we put in place better policies, research, technology development, and deployment, that we give leadership, the guidance, and collaboration with academia, industry, and governments, other governments, to move those partnerships forward on practical solutions. And I don't want this to sound like just sort of, the typical bureaucratic speak. The reality is we see real opportunity here to create that circular environment. And if we have the petrochemical industrial capacity, if we have the partnerships, if we can leverage the expertise of industry to advance plastics and plastics recycling geographically, and I think that the Breaking the Plastic Wave speaks to this, there are different areas within the globe where different types of technologies can be brought to bear in different types of policies. And in Canada and Alberta, because of the nature of the environment that we have and the capacity of the system, we see the ability to bring both the industry capacity together with a circular economy. And if we can become a global leader or Western North American leader in plastics recycling, in particular, advancing chemical recycling opportunities, we think that's going to support the opportunities to advance some of what Martin's talking about. And that's why I think we're likely to get forward, because we've got governments leaning into the space along with industry and others.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that, David. So we are now going to go to Jamie to get his insights.
Yes, so thank you. And I think when you look at the numbers, we're talking about a lot of capital, right, to get to where we need to go. And I think that's going to be partially public, but also a lot of private investment. And I think that investor is kind of a bit missing from the conversation right now. And part of that is because of the market signals. So I think the investors need very strong market signals. That's going to come from regulatory, legislative action that can accept those signals. It's also going to come from those companies at the top of the food chain, if you will, like the brands and the retailers who are setting targets and goals that can drive a system change as well. And so I don't think you'll see investors rushing into the space until you start to get really strong signals that this is where things are going. That said, I don't think, and I'd be concerned if investors stay on the sidelines waiting for these signals, right? Like, I think my take from the pandemic and what we've learned from the pandemic is just how, just the impacts of systemic risk, right? We've gotten a real appreciation for systemic risk. And I think what we need here is to acknowledge that this is a systemic risk, right? So investors need to really get on board with the idea of this is something that we need to drive solutions to. We can't just wait and then play off the opportunities and make some money. This is something that, if left unaddressed, becomes a systemic risk, much like climate change. And I think once you take that perspective, you'll start to see different actions that investors can take. For example, I think investors should be really engaging with the companies in their portfolios about their role in solutions to this and their role in driving that market towards where it needs to go. Such as those companies I mentioned at the top of the food chain. Like investors should be very vocal about supporting companies that are setting ambitious targets and ambitious goals and where they need to go to say, if we don't do this, then we all are at risk. And I think that's perspective is, I think, what's maybe currently missing in the investor crowd, and maybe part of that is education. Part of that's just a need to just clarify the opportunity for us. But I do see that to get where we need to get to, investors are going to have to be jumping into this space wholeheartedly. And if you look at Martin's graph there, as he mentioned, that is all opportunity. Like, the way some of those pies open up, that is opportunity. That's an investment opportunity waiting to happen. We just need to get there. And I think, once we have that momentum, you will see money pour into it. But we just can't wait for it to happen. We have to be part of the solution to drive it there.
Great, thanks, Jamie. Really appreciate that concept of systemic risk. So over to you, Kevin, your insights.
Yeah, I appreciate going last because I can sort of pick up on some of the language, and I think some great ideas offered up. Maybe I'd start, because we are a consumer-driven organization, I'd pick up on Martin's comments about utility, and obviously there's a great appeal to plastics and the use of plastics from a consumer perspective. And I think whether you asked before COVID or during COVID, or if you ask after COVID, the perspective is always going to be from the consumer, protect me, serve me well, and don't pollute. And I don't think we've seen any change in mindset there. Certainly the protect me and serve me piece on, from our business on food safety, for instance, and convenience. But the don't pollute piece sort of has tended to override in the conversation, and so over to us as industry to address that challenge. If you look at it, consumers are asked to do very little in the context of the kind of systemic plastics reduction that Martin's talking about, or other panelists are talking about. And so again, as I say, over to us, and industry needs to take it on. I would say again, a sort of COVID relevant comment would be, I have personally seen no diminished effort, and if anything, an uptick in effort within industry to address the challenge. And what does that mean? It means many of, I gave an optimistic perspective on the ability to solve in a generation. And the reason I offer that optimism is I believe within industry, it's well understood what the roadmap is and the challenges are. And I think if you look in the Canadian context or global context, the right conversations are happening, and those are leaning toward action. More specifically in the domestic market, if you look at producer involvement in EPR schemes, for instance, that's come up already. And the live challenge on all of these topics is when does the conversation lead to action? And I think we're very close. And so my take on the whole conversation thus far today is a lot of the arrows point to the producer community, whether that's making smarter decisions on the front end on volumes of plastics, types of plastics, our participation in the Canadian environment in EPR schemes, and then ultimately the need for innovation longer term. I think those are all live conversations, getting more and more professionalized by the day.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, everyone. Those are fantastic comments. The only thing that I think of right off the bat is we do not have enough time to discuss all this. There's so many interesting points. So we're going to jump into the questions now, and we're going to get some more feedback from all of you on some of these questions that we've seen come through on chat, some of the ones that we had set aside before. I just want to start with the whole COVID situation, because most of you mentioned that in one way or another. And I know, like Aaron had mentioned, the whole issue, we have all this extra waste now because of COVID. But at the same time, COVID has kind of it's given us this sense of urgency, and also this sense that we actually can change when we need to change. So what is different about this moment in time that gives us an opportunity to actually step up to this challenge? Aaron, maybe you can start that, please.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like, what I think COVID sort of did, and we've all touched on it, is it really showcased how unresilient our systems are, right? And more importantly, it just highlighted all of the all of the barriers that we have into getting circularity in materials writ large. And I'm going to talk about broadly materials that holistically. I know plastic is one of the main materials that we talk about, but really we're talking about how we are cascading value and keeping it in the system. And we have found that the system is completely broken as a part of diagnosing the root causes and getting to a theory of change of how we tackle the plastic waste problem. And so we knew that before COVID happened. Then COVID hit, and it just became more glaring. And on top of that, you know, some of those barriers that already existed around cost parity for oil, like for virgin materials versus recycled or even sustainably sourced bio-based, those are getting larger. Like that gap is growing because the cost of oil is cheap. And like Martin mentioned, in some areas of the world, recycling that was already not really working well is completely shut down. So it just sort of reinforces the need for us to really focus on how we systematically, you know, make step changes in improving the parts of the system that are completely broken and not just sort of eking it along. I think the final thing that I think was really interesting that came up as a part of COVID is how human safety, health and safety has really become paramount, right? And so that can also put at risk things like reuse systems. In the beginning of this, people stopped reusing again, and and having to build up the confidence, having scientists come forward and saying, no, the soap and water that's working on your hands, it also works on those reuse, right? But it also accelerated work in how to make reuse systems safer and how to make sure that the infrastructure, the legislation, the collection, the processing for reuse will work, because at the end of this, we ultimately need to reduce that virgin source of oil. And so I think that we need to make sure we are enabling all of the levers of change in the system to do that.
Great, thank you, Erin. We're definitely going to come back to the reduction piece later. I just wonder if we can maybe go back to Martin to talk a little bit about sort of how you see the whole COVID situation fitting into your thesis.
Thanks for assuming I've got a thesis. Look, I think all of whatever Erin says is true. I mean, we have these immediate short-term effects. Sort of we are a bit less prone towards systems of shared use. Sort of we need more hygienic protection. We sit more at home, and we need more packaging. There's more flooding into our homes through e-commerce, etc. All of that is happening. I think there's a couple of things that are happening on a much deeper level that in the long run will prevail. And I, being a geologist, sort of I believe in deep structures. The one is sort of we are more sensitive investors, Jeremy, to your point. We see that sort of how some of these things are brewing up, and we are developing better antennas for that. So if you think about the investability in this whole plastic sector, and just go back sort of if you accept the image of the wedges, so not only do you have to see where is there investabilities in some of those growth sectors, you should also consider there is a huge plastic bubble emerging in the other ones. I mean, sort of, I'm not taking sides here. I'm just telling you what the logical consequence of this wedge chart is. Sort of either we are right that either we want to have an ocean that sort of is keeping its biological productivity, or we want to have the market cap that currently sits in the virgin plastic sector. Both can't be true. It's like in climate change. Either we believe in Paris, or we believe in the current market cap. And I'm not saying which one is right. I'm just saying both can't be right. One of them can only be right. Same thing here. So there is something like we need to revisit the thesis that much of the demand that is getting lost due to the electrification of traffic in the fossil industry is being compensated by this massive growth that we see in the petrochemical industry, and particularly driven by polymers and by single-use applications. That can't be true if at the same time we believe in the future of a healthy ocean. That means that we need to review our thesis and potentially sort of move away from a definition chemical or petrochemical industry. We might want to move to a definition of a circular petrochemical industry, which all of a sudden is an interesting growth industry with lots of differentiation and innovation opportunity. Another undercurrent here is dematerialization driven by technology. So our life is getting dematerialized. Sort of for every idea that you have in the analog world, there is an there's a digital twin with a higher market capitalization somewhere on the market. Sort of, it's sort of with plastic, it's a bit harder to imagine what that looks like. With cars and with equipment, it's very easy. We are already moving there, and that world, that acceleration into a world where everything actually has its digital twin and a smarter way of getting the same utility has in fact been accelerating. And then the last thing is sort of we have a new handshake, a new public-private handshake here. And in a moment where so many companies actually have to come forth and say, look, here is my legitimacy, here is how you need to help us, here is how we would jointly want to go through the crisis. You need to have good answers of how you fit into a strategy that, by the way, 195 governments and then some governments, particularly in Canada and others, have signed up to when it comes to environmental and climate outcomes, have simply decided they want to go for. And you can't sort of offer for help if you don't have a concept that's 100% aligned with that. In the past, it was a bit of a philosophical thing. In Europe, I start feeling is there are 1.8 trillion on the table now for as recovery packages and midterm financing. You need to have a good story sort of to be eligible for those investments. There is a completely new way in which government and business will have to interact as we go through this inflection point.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin. And I think that really has handed it back over to you, Jamie, in terms of how that fits into the whole investment situation and things like carbon pricing, industry subsidies, like how did those all fit into this whole situation of the role that industry is playing?
Yeah, I mean, I think I do think that as investors, there is, I mean, there's a few different tracks here. I mean, one is just to have like your eye to the future and know that this is where things are heading, and be aware that, and as Martin says, there are some systemic risks to your investments in the current economy as it stands. And so, like, hopefully you have your eye to the future and where the trend is going. But in terms of functionally, what that means is I do think investors have to show like some strong support for things like policy changes, things like carbon pricing, right? Like that, things that give us market certainty, that give us a direction, like a travel that we know we're heading towards, you know, somewhere that we can put our money towards that will be low carbon, but also addressing plastic. So I don't think investors at the moment are maybe, I mean, there's a lot of activity there, but maybe we're not coherent enough right now and not working together enough on sending those signals to various governments around the world that we're supportive of this shift and that we want to see this happening. It still does come down to investors and their money, right? And so we do have to put at some point our you know, money where our mouth is, I guess, if you will, to exploit these opportunities. And that will take, as you say, you know, to coin a phrase, like some bravery for investors to go down that path. But I do feel that once we get some momentum on this, as Martin says, like the opportunities start to really become evident, and we will see the capital flow. But I think it does start to me with this idea of systemic risk and just acknowledging that we need to get there. We shouldn't be on the sidelines of this. We should just be acknowledging this is where we need to get to, and then supporting all those various levers that will get us there.
Great, thanks. I'm going to send it back over to you, David, because the whole concept Martin had brought up the idea of a circular petrochemical industry. And I know that's something that Alberta is looking at, but I guess it's a question of how bold that governments can be in terms of things like removing subsidies, you know, creating more level playing field, that sort of thing, and creating that circular plastics economy. I wonder if you can just speak to that from the Alberta government point of view.
Yeah, no, thanks, Christina. I think that it's, you know, and I've been watching the comments come in as well and thinking through this. There is a balance that governments are going to try to find relative to the economy and the environment. And I know that the two can actually, they're inextricably linked. And so in the case of that circular plastics environment, that circular plastics economy, and how that ties to petrochemicals, and everybody will know that Alberta has committed to investment in the petrochemical space. It's a significant economic opportunity for the province. but we're also trying to do that in a way that leverages the carbon tax, as I said earlier, and people have asked, where does that come into play? Well, as you're driving carbon costs associated with any production facility at all, then those petrochemical producers need to make sure that they're managing those costs. And you have companies like Dow and others who are starting to look to, all of their sustainability ambitions and goals that they need to meet. So we're working with them. I think what's really critical for Alberta to look at in that space is, how do we bring real innovation into the space? And I think, I agree with the comments that people are making that, there's a multiplicity of solutions that need to come into place here. We need to think about reduction of use. That doesn't necessarily mean to think that we need to stop making virgin plastics. We need to think about maybe what are the best things to use those virgin plastics for. And that's an industry conversation with consumers and investors and others. Governments have a role in some regard in there, but it's, certainly Alberta is a strongly market-centric, province, so we see that. But where we can play a role is on bringing innovation and research to the table, bringing together, and we're having those conversations now in the province. It's not broadly public, but we are having conversations about how to get industry and us and academia and researchers at the table. How do we get the right funding moving into that to get creative solutions around both reduction in emissions, reductions in impact, chemical advanced recycling, a whole variety of aspects on that. We're not necessarily going to be positioned to do everything everybody wants us to do as a province, but I think we need to show leadership in some of these areas. And I think we need to be able to export that capability into areas that right now lack it, whether it be an EPR framework. And maybe that's the last comment I'll make is, if you think about an EPR framework, Alberta doesn't have one right now. We are seriously looking at it. We are going to be going out and having conversations with a broad swath of industry and sector and recycling agencies. We think we need to align it with British Columbia and other sectors. We need to think about how we align it down to the US and how we can get a lot of that feedstock that is sitting in British Columbia and other places that doesn't have the ability to do anything more than mechanical recycling. If we have the chemical processes that can actually enable it, then let's leverage those for a broader geographical region so we can have a greater and greater impact. That's where some of what we're going to do is. I think you're on mute, Christina.
Sorry, that was a fail. I was going to say that I think I was muted on purpose because I said I'm going to hold you to some of these. You realize that. So I'm actually going to take this to Kevin now. Kevin, we've been talking about leadership and innovation, and obviously there is such a key role for industry to play in that. But in terms of the obligation that you have to your customers, maybe you can just speak a little bit to the role that you have in terms of leadership.
Yeah, I think I touched on it a little bit already, and there's a level of expectations, and you can jump from consumers to some of the comments Jamie has made. So whether your audience is a consumer or an investor, I think the expectation is for action. The expectation is for ambition. We've seen that in other categories, and plastics, as much as it's not a new subject whatsoever, I think what you're hearing from the panel is there's still a lot of questions around how to actually move it forward. What are the best decisions? What are the immediate decisions? What are the long-term decisions? And you look at something like innovation, and that's a great example. It's very difficult for us as a retailer, for instance, to make decisions on innovations that are far off, but we can certainly make good decisions based on the innovations or based on the technologies that are available to us. And so I think if I can simplify it, it would be consumers are asking us to do the right things, and then they're also asking for ambition. And I genuinely believe that message has sunk in very clearly, and that industry gets it.
Fantastic. Okay, I cannot believe how fast the time has gone. This has been such a stimulating discussion. Thank you so much, all of you. And I think to wrap this now, we are going to end with a final question for you to actually give us a little bit more inspiration and a key takeaway. So I wonder if all of you can very quickly just reflect on what we've talked about today and the challenge that we face, but more specifically, what really gives you hope that we can actually turn the tide on this urgent issue? And that's both here in Canada, that's North America, and that's globally. So what gives you the inspiration that we can actually turn the tide? So I think maybe I'll just start quickly on this with Martin.
So you're asking me for the one big thing, the one silver. Well, I just gave a talk about how there's not a silver bullet, and now you're asking what's a silver bullet. Did you listen? So
Maybe not.
no, I'm trying something which sort of I'm sure will resonate with Kevin, because Loblaw is taking a very prominent position here. David, others, Erin, definitely. EPR. I think what gives me hope is the fact that there is a very, very effective tool out there, which is around extending producer responsibility and making producers act as if they were the continuous owners of a product. The way you do that is through extended producer responsibility. And the good thing is that it is currently so underused that we can expect that there is much potential, not just in the global north, but also in the global south. We should almost jointly come together and help all the countries on earth to build these EPR systems. In the same way, sort of we are sending these items called airline passengers only to other countries if they are treated there and routed there based on international standard called sort of IATA procedures. Why not make sure if even a plastic product that actually is sent to a certain country is also treated and routed to the same international standard? Building up such a system is not easy, but it's doable, as we have seen in airlines or in IATA procedures. Why not do the same for industrial products like plastic? If we had a world with EPR, we'd be much better off. It does two things. It funds for collection, and B, it gives us the right incentive to treat something as if we would see it again.
Excellent, thank you. Jamie, what gives you hope?
I mean, what gives me hope, and it's kind of playing off what Martin just said around EPR, and I would say I like EPR as well, but what I think that drives is the innovation, right? Like once we have that, we'll start to see the real push for that innovation. And in terms of whether this is what gives me hope, I mean, I think of things like circularity and a circular business model. To me, that is the next big thing facing investors in terms of an opportunity suite. Like we've talked about climate for a long time, and while we haven't solved that by any means, we have some path and we kind of see where we can go. The next thing that's going to grip, I think, investor circles, hopefully, is this idea of circularity, right? Is suddenly realizing, okay, that's not enough. Actually, the model we had, you can kind of play around the edges, but it's really not enough. What we need is circularity. And so plastics, I think, is showing us the start of that path and how we can get there. And so to me, what I hope is the experience with plastics and showing some success on that front takes it well beyond plastics and into this concept of circularity and how do we make that real. So that's where my hope lies.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Jamie. And so if I can just turn it back to you then, David, in terms of, because this obviously is very reflective on some of the policy issues that you're dealing with. What gives you hope that we can actually deal with this plastics pollution issue?
I think it's, I've been trying to think of the word actually along the way. I want to say, I'm used to saying whole of government. It's not whole of government. It is the sector, people, consumers, investors, companies, governments, recycling organizations, innovation space, like all of them are seized with the issue. And so when I think about that is, you know, there's roles government can play with regards to convening and bringing all of that together so that we can put in place the policies and other pieces. We're not the only people that have place, but because everybody is thinking of how do we resolve this issue, we actually have momentum for a conversation, albeit a brave conversation, as you said, where we can bring ideas together and then advance the things that will work. And it's not one single thing, as Martin said. It's EPR, it's chemical recycling, it's reuse programs, it is, you know, substitution where it makes sense to substitute. Like it's all of those things together that we need to do. And I think there's a lot of momentum building to do that. And I think the scale and the economics of it are shifting as well right now. And that makes sense.
Okay, fantastic. So I get the sense you think there's an opportunity for us now to have a high level of collaboration, which is obviously key. Thank you so much. So Kevin, just tell us what gives you hope.
Yeah, I'll be really quick because it's a bit of a ditto. I would say this idea that the value chain needs to come together. So, you know, if you think of a circular economy made up of a bunch of little arches or arcs, and you sort out where you belong in that circle, good decision making at every phase is going to be the difference between whether it works or not. And the reason I'm optimistic about that is you know, whether it's just the general conversation, the ambition, or specifics like you know, the rapidly forming Canadian Plastics Pact. There is this idea that we need to be better at linking the value chain, and that each of us needs to be making better decisions. So it's, you know, music to our ears to hear David saying it, pretty much precisely that. And certainly if there was one idea that sort of moves us forward, I think, whether it's the actions of the value chain or the policy behind it, is this idea of harmony. Let's pick some good processes and let's push them.
Yeah, fantastic. Great. Okay, Aaron, last word to you. If we can just hear what inspires you and gives you hope that we can solve this issue.
Yeah, so let's be clear. You know, my organization is tackling all of these large global crises, right? And every single one of them, at the heart of solutions, is sector level transformational change in a coordinated way. And that's really hard to do. And what we're finding in the plastic waste crisis for the first time ever is we have the majority of the people at the table, and they are leaning in on things that they would not have supported in the past. You know, Martin brought up EPR. That is a discussion that businesses would not have been excited about, especially in the United States where I'm from, a year ago. And now they're like, man, to meet our goals, we need to have policies, and we need to have financial mechanisms, and we need to pay for it. That, I mean, they are admitting that they need to make less and really rethink how they deliver products to consumers. You know, the conversations we're having today, we just wouldn't have had 2 years ago. So that gives me hope. And the last thing that I'll just close with is that with this issue, every little bit helps, right? So every time that any individual takes a moment to rethink the way they use and experience plastic, whether that's what they're choosing to buy, how they're reusing it in their home, or what they do with it when they're done with it, that matters. The same way all of these major initiatives matter and all of the commitments matter. So I have hope because we're all leaning in together for the first time.
Fantastic. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, everybody. Oh, this has been so inspirational. Really, it has. Thank you so much. Thank you, Martin, Kevin, Aaron, David, and Jamie. Again, thank you for sharing your time. Thank you for sharing your expertise, and especially thank you for sharing your inspiration. So on behalf of the Circular Economy Leadership Coalition and the Globe Series, thank you so much for being part of this. And thank you everybody who attended as well. And thank you to Environment and Climate Change Canada for providing financial support to make this session happen. And thanks for everybody in the audience. This is such an important discussion. It's a challenge that's great. It's a challenge that's really important. It requires unprecedented dialogue and collaboration, as we've already discussed, and that's the only way that we're going to end up with success. So we really want to make sure that we continue the conversation. So hopefully you'll continue to be part of this conversation and join us for the next installment in the series. And that is going to be happening on December 16th. At that time, we're going to be looking at how to unpack the innovation potential required to move to circular plastics. You can check out the series and the information that you'll need to be able to sign up for that session at circulareconomysolutionsseries.com. That's where you're going to get more information. That's also where you can find the recording that has been made of today's session. So if you want to hear these inspiring words again, you can certainly do that. So thank you again so much, everybody. Fabulous session, and I look forward to working with you in the future to making a circular plastics economy happen.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.